Welcome to Journal of the Fallen, where we read between the lines of those who never returned from war, or never truly came back. Tonight, we open the Journal of Karl Brenner, a German combat engineer stationed on the Eastern Front. His words are technical, deliberate at first, full of angles and weights, wood types, and blast radius calculations. But over time, his writing phrase, as the war turns, so does Karl's mind, from calculation to contemplation, from blueprints to burdens. In his quiet notes, buried beneath lists and supply logs, we find something deeper. A man who measured the weight of bridges, and later the cost of what those bridges carried. Close your eyes. Let your breath slow, and listen to the journal of a builder in a war that only knew how to break. Imagine you are Karl. You are not trained to fight. You are trained to calculate. You walk with a canvas satchel full of rulers and calipers, spools of wire, nails, charges, and paper. Always paper, wrinkled blueprints pulled from your breast pocket, folded neatly, then dirtied by snow and grease. You rise before the infantry. You are awake before the gunfire. You build before anyone advances. The cold hits first. You lace your boots by lantern light, fingers raw. In the engineer's tent, there is no shouting, just quiet movement. Men folding their gear, rolling wires, counting dynamite bundles. Karl checks his notes. Today's task: a floating footbridge across a frozen stream near Kursk. Last week he helped lay mines. Next week he'll be asked to wire demolitions beneath a captured rail line. He no longer questions the task. He simply executes. They gather timber from shelled barns, splintered wagons, fallen fences. Every piece of wood has a story, and now a new purpose. Oak from a church door makes strong support beams, Karl once wrote. I do not tell the men where I find it. The team builds in silence. Axes strike in rhythm. Karl draws in the margins of his notes. Force diagrams, arch loads, simple joys from another life. When the bridge is done, he doesn't cross it. He simply watches the others do so. Infantry, supply trucks, a wounded man on a cart, his leg already blackened. I built a path, Karl writes that night, but I don't know if it leads forward or simply deeper into something none of us understand. At first glance, Karl's war is quiet, mathematical, methodical, no bayonet charges, no heroic declarations. But that quietness masks something else, complicity wrapped in routine. He is not trying to win, he is trying to solve. And yet each solved problem leads more men into fire. What does it mean to build when everything around you is meant to fall? In the next segment, we open the pages where Karl speaks of a man he couldn't save, and the moment when calculations failed to hold the world together. The journal opens with new handwriting, stiffer, slanted, as if the hand holding the pencil was colder or less sure. Karl's entry begins. It was the third bridge in 2 days. I told the officer the load weight was too high. He didn't care. We crossed anyway. The sun had not risen. The sky was silver, smeared with low fog and soot. The river below, frozen but barely, made the sound of cracking teeth beneath each step. The bridge they built was a makeshift span of planks and rail scrap. No railings, no safety, just speed. A supply cart went first, then a line of foot soldiers, then a fuel truck. That's when the ice cracked. Not loudly, not violently, just a low moan, a sudden sag, a creak no louder than a groan through clenched teeth. Karl saw it happen in slow motion. The right rear wheel dipped, the left support buckled. A man ran to help, shouting at the driver to reverse, but it was too late. The cart went in sideways, Carl wrote, and the man with it. I never knew his name. The water swallowed quickly. The broken planks pulled down with the weight. For a few seconds the man's hands surfaced, grasping at air, slapping at wood. Then, nothing. Silence but for the groan of a half-collapsed bridge, still trembling under retreating boots. Carl stood on the bank, unable to move. He looked at me, he wrote, not in panic, not in blame, but in recognition, like I was a part of it. Later that night, Carl redrew the support schematics, not to fix them, not for the next bridge, but to try and find the precise moment it failed, where the beam bent, how the weight shifted, whether an extra bolt might have saved him. He circled the place in the diagram, twice, and beneath it wrote, "This is where he died. Not here, in the river, but here on paper, in the numbers." The act of writing it down didn't help. The act of understanding made it worse. Breathe softly. There are soldiers who kill with rifles, and there are others who do so without ever firing a shot. Carl built bridges. He cleared roads. He laid charges that turned night into thunder. But it wasn't until a man looked at him while falling through ice that he understood what he was part of. A war not of choice. A war not of defense. A war where even builders could become destroyers by doing nothing more than their job. In the next segment, Carl begins to question the very language of his profession. He stops drawing, he stops calculating, and he begins to see the war not as a map, but as a graveyard. Carl's handwriting changes again. Gone is the neat architect's scrawl. Now the letters tilt, swell, repeat. Some lines begin and trail off. Sentences no longer form paragraphs. They scatter like broken tools on a workbench. Pencil snapped in the frost. I took it as a sign. So begins the entry dated January 2nd, 1943. It happened mid-morning during bridge calculations near the Dnieper River. A snapped carpenter's pencil, brittle from cold and age. Normally, Carl would replace it. He had 3 more in his pouch. But this time he stared at the broken graphite like it had spoken. The pencil broke in 2 clean halves. I didn't reach for another. I sat there, watching the line I didn't finish. He closed his notebook, walked away, didn't report the measurements. It happened mid-morning, during bridge calculations near the Dnieper River. A snapped carpenter's pencil, brittle from cold and age. Normally Carl would replace it. He had 3 more in his pouch. But this time he stared at the broken graphite like it had spoken. The pencil broke in 2 clean halves. I didn't reach for another. I sat there, watching the line I didn't finish. He closed his notebook, walked away, didn't report the measurements. Eventually, Carl refused to build. He faked a sprain, took longer to draw, claimed incomplete data. One officer beat him with a glove. Another reassigned him to maintenance. Carl didn't resist. The war has too many builders, he scribbled. Maybe if I stop, someone else will have to look at what we're making. But even while sweeping bunkers or hauling crates, his mind kept constructing, not bridges but meaning. Why build? Who walks across? What does it lead to? He began to realize he'd never built anything that led to peace. Close your eyes. Imagine holding a tool, something that once gave you control, purpose, identity. Now that same object feels foreign, wrong, as if your hands no longer trust it. That was Carl with his pencil, with his rulers, with his math. He had spent years calculating load weights and blast radii, and suddenly all he could feel was the burden of having been accurate and complicit. In the next segment, Carl writes his first and only unsent letter, not to family, not to friends, but to the bridge itself that claimed the man beneath the ice. The entry was folded. Different paper. The lines were not standard issue Wehrmacht ledger. They were from a civilian notebook, frayed and faintly lined in blue. At the top, no date, no location, just 4 words. To the bridge at Kharkov. Carl's journal, usually technical, had become abstract. But this was something else entirely. He wrote as if the bridge, the sagging, broken span that took a man with it into the ice, were alive. Not a metaphor, not poetic flourish, but real. As if the bridge could answer. As if it too might remember. Here is a reconstructed excerpt. You held as long as you could. I know that now. I did not blame you then, but I should have understood better. You were never meant to carry that much weight, or that kind of silence. I chose the wrong timber for your right support. I knew it was warped, but I didn't speak. There was frost on the boards. The rope was frayed. And then he fell. You let him go. But it wasn't your fault. It was mine. Later in the same entry, Carl sketches the bridge, again, but this time adds human figures along it. A soldier walking alone. A cart half sunk in slush, a pair of boots just beginning to tilt over the edge. He labels the sketch. This is not a structure. This is a grave. He writes about the wood used. Oak warped by humidity. The ropes salvaged from a burned village. The nails reused from a rail tie. And the time always too little. But none of this is technical anymore. Carl is not analyzing. He is mourning. I used to think building things made me different from those who destroyed. That engineers were clean-handed. That bridges were neutral. I was wrong. Carl had once taken pride in never firing a rifle. But now he saw the truth, that the bridge he built may have saved dozens, perhaps hundreds, but it also gave permission for death to move forward. He enabled movement, and that movement had no conscience. Take a long breath. There's a specific kind of guilt reserved for those whose hands look clean, but whose work was essential. The medic who held someone down during an interrogation. The cook who fed a unit that raised a village. The engineer who made sure the tanks could roll. Carl's letter to the bridge is not just apology. It's an attempt to locate blame within craft, to ask whether something you build can be both functional and fatal. I built so others could move forward. But what if forward was the wrong direction? In the next segment, Carl begins to retreat not just from war, but from himself. He builds a secret, something hidden, something not in service to anyone, and we discover the quiet space where he tried to reclaim his humanity. Carl never told anyone about it. The entry begins with a vague note. Found a collapsed root cellar near the tree line. Reinforced the roof with dry pine. No one has followed me here yet. It was a space no wider than a garden shed, half buried in the snow, obscured by frost-bitten undergrowth. Originally a farmer's storage pit, perhaps, but now it was something else. Inside, Carl began building again. But not bridges, not bombs, not anything that could support weight or carry soldiers forward. He built miniatures. carved from scavenged wood, fence posts, ammo crates, broken beams. He shaped tiny, silent figures. Children, old men, horses, sparrows, one girl with her arms crossed. No names, no paint, just silhouettes of people he remembered, or perhaps imagined. They don't need to speak, Carl wrote. They just need to exist, quietly, as I wish I could. He had no tools but a dull pocket knife and a shard of glass. No plans, no measurements. Still, each figure took shape slowly, deliberately, over hours, sometimes days. He would hide them in the walls of bunkers, slip them into crates, leave them on ledges near outposts, half buried in snow. Once he watched a soldier find one, a wooden boy holding nothing, and tuck it into his coat without a word. I don't care if they survive, Carl wrote. I only care that they exist somewhere I cannot go. Over time, Carl filled the walls of his hidden shelter with rows of these figures, some sitting, some standing, one lying flat, face turned upward. He began calling the space his silent battalion. They were not soldiers. They were memory made solid. When he was ordered back into active construction work, he would return here at night, in darkness, without light, carving by feel, not sight. Close your eyes. Imagine shaping something delicate, not because it will be seen or praised or used, but simply because it brings you peace. That's what Carl did in his final months. His hands still worked, but they no longer obeyed command. They carved instead of constructed, remembered instead of measured. In a war obsessed with efficiency, Carl made something useless, and that was its power. In the next segment, we return to his notebook to uncover a list he began keeping, not of supplies, not of plans, but of the names he remembered, and the ones he was afraid he'd forget. The page is thin and creased. Ink bleeds slightly at the corners, as though damp fingers once held it for too long. At the top, one word is underlined in thick, deliberate strokes: names. There is no date, no rank, no explanations. Just a list, written in the middle of the war, when time was measured in survival, and yet Carl chose to measure it in memory. The list begins: Kolb, Anton Dieter Franzi, unnamed Russian boy, dead at Bridge Lena, scarf like smoke, stared through you, then a break. Then more. Some names have dashes next to them. Some have full notes in parentheses. Some are just a single word, and a few are blank. I knew them, Carl scribbled in the margin, but I do not remember their names, only their hands. Carl stopped writing engineering reports, stopped logging bridge materials, stopped filing the names of officers who barked at him. But this list he returned to often. It became ritual. Add a name, whisper it aloud, fold the page, place it in his coat pocket, touch it before sleep. Sometimes he would rewrite the same list, word for word, on a new page, just to keep the act of remembering fresh. Names fade faster than structures, he wrote, but names carry more weight. What's striking is how incomplete the entries become. Later editions look like this: girl from bakery, soot on cheeks, man with limp, never asked for help, crying child, ran from dog, voice at dusk, didn't see the face. It's the fragments I fear losing most, Carl notes. They have no graves, no letters, only this list. His identity as an engineer, one who relied on exactness, had collapsed, and in its place was a man trying to preserve the blurred edges of what made the war human. let your mind rest. Think of the people you've known only briefly, a face on a bus, a teacher's voice, a stranger's hand that steadied you. Now imagine being surrounded by thousands like that, all moving, suffering, vanishing. Carl could not hold on to the war. He could not change it. But he could try, just try, to hold on to the names. Not to make sense of the chaos, but to say in some quiet way, "You were here, I saw you. I did not forget." In the next segment, Carl begins to write one last unsent letter. Not to a bridge, not to a comrade, but to someone waiting back home. A person whose name is never spoken, but whose absence is felt on every line. The handwriting here is more deliberate. Each line is steady, straight, as if Carl had taken special care with this entry, not because it would be sent, but because it could have been. At the top of the page, no greeting, no dear, no name, just a blank space. Then, in small letters, you will never read this, but I have to write it. From the first sentence, we understand Carl is writing to someone left behind. A woman, perhaps, maybe a sister, maybe a wife, or just someone he once walked with beneath a canopy of leaves before the war. But there's no affection written plainly. No sweet memories, just this. Do you still sit on the same bench? I imagine it's cracked by now, the tree above it thinner, but maybe the light still falls the same in the afternoon. The letter never mentions war directly. He doesn't describe battles or the front. He doesn't talk about death. Instead, he speaks in questions and imagined scenes. Do you still light the stove slowly like you used to? Is your hair still the same, or has the cold changed it? Have the pigeons returned to the roof? It is a letter trying to time travel, back to a life untouched by the sound of artillery or the weight of responsibility. And yet, under each sentence, there is a sense of guilt. If I were braver, I would have written to you sooner. But I'm not sure how to carry both this war and your name. Carl never gives a reason, but the clues are there. The envelope is torn. The ink runs near the bottom, like he wept. There is no address. Perhaps she was lost. Perhaps writing to her made her more real, and that hurt too much. Or maybe, deep down, Carl didn't want this letter read. Maybe this letter wasn't for her at all. It was for himself, a final, fragile act of remembrance, a thread to a life he no longer believed he deserved. Not every letter is meant to be mailed. Some are written to preserve hope, others to bury it. Carl's letter reminds us that memory has no return address. It lives in the quiet spaces of the heart. When war severs connection, sometimes the only way to speak is on paper no one will ever read. In the next segment, Carl finds an unexpected moment of stillness, a sunrise he watches alone for the first time in months, and a fleeting sense that beauty still exists, even here. It was early January 1943. The Eastern Front was wrapped in biting, cold, gray skies, heavy with snow. Carl woke before dawn as usual, but something was different. He stepped outside his shelter. The air was still, crisp and sharp, with the faint scent of pine and frozen earth. The horizon bled softly from navy blue to pale pink, then to gold. There was no gunfire, no distant rumble of tanks or artillery, just the gentle crackle of frost underfoot, a thin wisp of smoke from a far-off chimney. Carl pulled his coat tighter around him. He could feel the cold biting his cheeks, but his breath formed calm clouds in the air. He watched as the first rays of sun slipped over a ridge, casting long shadows on the snow-covered landscape. "I stood still," he wrote, "and for a moment I was not an engineer, a soldier, or a witness. I was just a man. Close your eyes. Imagine that moment, the soft glow of dawn in a place meant for darkness. No orders, no fear, just the slow, patient rise of light. A brief pause, a breath, a reminder. Even in the harshest winters, the sun will rise. And sometimes that simple truth is enough." It was the kind of moment that might have been overlooked by most, a simple act amid the relentless cold and noise of war. Karl sat quietly with a fellow soldier, Jakob, huddled behind a crumbling wall on the edge of their encampment. The sky was still pale with dawn, and the ground beneath them was hard and unyielding, frost glittering in the weak light. From his pack, Karl pulled out a small loaf of bread rough, dense and barely more than a handful. It was the kind of bread baked with coarse flour and aged to last long in their sparse rations. He broke it carefully, the crust cracking softly between his fingers, the scent faintly nutty and comforting, despite its hardness. Jakob accepted a piece without a word, their fingers briefly brushing in the exchange. No grand speeches, no declarations of hope or despair, just the quiet communion of two men sharing what little they had. The cold air hung heavily around them, but for a moment warmth radiated in the space between. Karl noted the muted crunch of snow beneath their boots, the distant caw of a crow, the faint whistle of wind threading through broken walls. These sounds, so ordinary, felt startlingly intimate. Neither man spoke. There was no need. The silence was companionable, an acknowledgment of shared struggle, an unspoken understanding. Karl's journal captured this fragile moment with tenderness rarely found in the logbooks of war. "We ate slowly, each bite a small defiance against the emptiness. No words were spoken, yet between us a bridge was formed, not of wood or iron, but of presence." This simple act, breaking bread in the cold, became a quiet anchor in the storm of his mind, a reminder that even when surrounded by destruction, the essence of humanity could be preserved in the smallest gestures. In this fragile pause, Karl found a fleeting peace that no order, no battle plan could provide. Take a deep breath and let this moment linger. In the midst of chaos, it is often the smallest act, shared bread, a glance, a touch that carry the greatest weight. And sometimes those quiet moments are enough to carry a person forward. The night was heavy with frost and quiet, the kind of silence that presses on the ears. Karl found a rare moment alone, sitting beneath the skeletal remains of a once grand farmhouse, its shattered windows like empty eyes staring into a lost past. He opened his journal, the pages worn from cold fingers, and began to write of things that didn't belong to war, small fragments from another time. "I remember the laughter of children playing by the riverbank, their voices like bells ringing through the afternoon air, the scent of fresh hay and wildflowers mixing with the distant hum of village life." He paused, feeling the weight of absence settle around him. Those sounds felt impossibly distant, like a fading dream. My brother would race me along the dusty roads. We never cared about the future, only the sun on our faces and the wind in our hair. It was a simpler time. The memories were bittersweet. They were warmth in the cold, a fragile thread connecting Karl to a self he feared he had lost. He described the taste of fresh bread baked by their mother, the way sunlight filtered through the trees in spring, and the way laughter could fill a room with hope. But even these gentle recollections carried a shadow. Now, laughter is a rarity, and when it comes, it echoes too loudly like a distant melody I fear will be drowned out forever. Carl's words were not merely remembrance. They were a quiet plea, a holding on. In the midst of destruction, the laughter of the past became a beacon, faint, fragile, but unextinguished. Take a moment to imagine those soft sounds, the tinkling laughter, the rustle of leaves, the warmth of sunlight on a cold day. In the silence of the present, these echoes remind us that even when all seems lost, life's gentle moments endure quietly beneath the noise. Carl never labeled these pages as letters, but the tone changed. Each paragraph began with something like a greeting, but not a formal one. Sometimes it was just a simple "you" or a memory placed directly in second person, as though speaking to someone who had long ago faded from his world. You would have hated the cold here. Your hands were always wrapped in gloves, even in early fall. If you were here, you'd tell me this fog smells like rust. You'd be right. It clings to my coat like old blood. These letters were not sent. They weren't even folded. Carl kept them wedged between pages of technical notes, old inventory sheets, and maps stained with soot and oil. Some were written on the backs of empty ration forms, others on scraps of packaging, each one scrawled when time allowed or when silence pressed too heavily on his thoughts. And in these moments Carl's voice soft. He wrote with care, with longing, and most tellingly, with restraint. I saw a fox today, just one standing at the edge of the clearing, watching me. For a second I wondered if it remembered a world before all this. I tried to whistle the tune you used to hum while cooking. My breath cracked in the cold, and it didn't sound right, but I remembered it anyway. There is no anger in these letters, no frustration, just fatigue and yearning. He doesn't ask for forgiveness, nor does he beg for peace. He simply shares. And as each note unfolds, we begin to see Carl's coping, not as survival, but as a quiet ritual of remembrance. These shadow letters, unsent, unspoken, are not cries for help. They are echoes of a voice trying not to disappear. If I forget how to speak to you, I will forget how to speak to myself. Close your eyes and imagine writing a message with no expectation of reply. Only the motion of the pen, the rhythm of the breath, the hope that in writing, even if no one hears, something inside you remains intact. The walls of the hidden root cellar had once been plain, damp, covered in patches of mold, and the faint scent of decay from long-rotted vegetables. But as weeks passed and silence grew thick, Carl began to work into them, not repairs, not reinforcements. He carved. First, simple shapes, notches, lines, symbols. Then figures, scenes, names. Using a rusted utility knife and, later, a shard of broken glass, he began to press his memories directly into the wood. There were trees, tall, symmetrical, lining a road that no longer existed. There was a bird in mid-flight, wings stretched. A violin, a woman's silhouette. The outlines of children's shoes, marching single file. Most haunting were the faces, just outlines. Eyes that didn't look forward, but downward. No mouths, as if the silence extended even into the wood. Some carvings were labeled, others were not. One simply read, "So you don't disappear." Carl wrote little about this in his journal, but the few notes that exist say enough. When paper runs out, The wall remembers. Every cut is a sentence. Every groove a name. He didn't see this as art or preservation. It was something deeper, quieter. It was the urge to witness when language failed. The need to leave behind a world that was more than rubble and ruins. Sometimes he'd return to a carving days later and trace it with his fingers, like a blind man remembering a friend's face. By the end of the winter, the walls were nearly full. His hidden cellar had become something else. Not a bunker, not a prison, but a chapel of memory, one he built alone, for no one, and for everyone. Let your eyes rest for a moment. Imagine a man underground, carving by candlelight alone, not to record history, but to keep it from vanishing entirely. In the next segment, we'll uncover a journal entry unlike the others, a list not of tools or supplies, but of things he missed most, the sounds, the smells. The moments too small for official record. It was scribbled on the back of a burnt map. The ink was faded, the handwriting uneven. The title, written softly at the top in small, neat script, What I Miss. Carl had written it during a night when the snow fell without pause, and the wind hissed through the cracks in his shelter like a tired whisper. There was no heat, no sound beyond his breath and the scratching of pen to paper. And yet, in this silence, he chose to remember. Not the war, not the friends he'd lost, not the buildings he once designed, but the smallest things, the quiet ones. Warm bread with jam in the morning, the sound of rain on a copper roof, my brother's bad singing, the weight of my father's coat, a cat purring on my chest, wind through dry autumn trees, the clink of glass in a quiet kitchen, a clock ticking in a safe room, my name spoken gently, shoes drying by the fire. Each item was a whisper of a life before, each memory a rebellion against what he had become. This list wasn't chronological. It wasn't organized. It was felt, scattered like the ashes he walked through daily. The list ended without punctuation, just one last line. Laughing without listening for bombs. This segment of Carl's journal is more than nostalgia. It's a quiet ache, a reaching hand in the dark. He doesn't dwell on what was taken by war. He simply notes what once was, and in doing so preserves it. Close your eyes for a moment and think of the small things, the quiet rituals of your life. What would you miss if the world around you vanished? Carl didn't write this list for anyone else. He wrote it so those things could live. Somewhere. This page was strange, not in tone, not in words, but in the way Carl returned to a part of himself that had been silent for so long, the engineer. Tucked between journal entries and fading thoughts was a folded sheet of coarse paper. On it, a set of sketches drawn with startling precision. Beams, arches, tension lines, soil depth, support weight. It was a bridge, entirely imagined, designed by candlelight, far from any war plan or battlefield directive. This one crosses no river, he wrote. It is not for tanks, not for victory. It's for crossing a place inside me I haven't dared approach in months. Carl had named it the Bridge to Return. No location, no coordinates. He only described the setting around it. On the left, a forest of birch trees yellowing with fall. On the right, a village lane. 2 lamplights, no people. The river below is shallow, no threat, but still needs crossing. He went on to calculate the materials, even though none would ever be gathered. He adjusted the arch to accommodate the weight of horses, not trucks. He removed the rails, because the people crossing it know the way. It was never meant to be real. It was a map of longing, a structure that existed only to remind him of something quietly human, the idea of going home. Not home as a place, but as a state of being. I needed to build something that wasn't for destruction, he scrawled in the margin. Something no one would walk over but me. The bridge was small, useless by military standards, but elegant, gentle, full of deliberate curves and thoughtful weight balance. It was perhaps the only thing Carl built during the war that was truly his. Let your thoughts settle here. Imagine designing something not for the world, but for your own survival, a quiet architecture of the soul. In the next segment, Carl recounts a conversation by firelight, an exchange with a soldier who never spoke again, but who left behind a phrase Carl would carry to his final day. This page was strange, not in tone, not in words, but in the way Carl returned to a part of himself that had been silent for so long, the engineer. Tucked between journal entries and fading thoughts was a folded sheet of coarse paper. On it, a set of sketches drawn with startling precision. Beams, arches, tension lines, soil depth, support weight. It was a bridge entirely imagined, designed by candlelight, far from any war plan or battlefield directive. This one crosses no river, he wrote. It is not for tanks, not for victory. It's for crossing a place inside me I haven't dared approach in months. Carl had named it the bridge to return. No location, no coordinates. He only described the setting around it. On the left, a forest of birch trees yellowing with fall. On the right, a village lane. 2 lamplights, no people. The river below is shallow, no threat, but still needs crossing. He went on to calculate the materials, even though none would ever be gathered. He adjusted the arch to accommodate the weight of horses, not trucks. He removed the rails because the people crossing it know the way. It was never meant to be real. It was a map of longing, a structure that existed only to remind him of something quietly human, the idea of going home. Not home as a place, but as a state of being. I needed to build something that wasn't for destruction, he scrawled in the margin. Something no one would walk over but me. The bridge was small, useless by military standards, but elegant, gentle, full of deliberate curves and thoughtful weight balance. It was perhaps the only thing Carl built during the war that was truly his. Let your thoughts settle here. Imagine designing something not for the world, but for your own survival, a quiet architecture of the soul. In the next segment, Carl recounts a conversation by firelight, an exchange with a soldier who never spoke again, but who left behind a phrase Carl would carry to his final day. There is no dramatic ending in Carl's journal, no signature, no marked goodbye. The final page begins without a title, just a slow, wandering paragraph, the kind written when the hand is tired but the heart has one last thing to say. The pencil lines are lighter, less forceful, as if the weight of war had finally begun to dull even his desire to remember. And yet, this last page is perhaps the most intimate. I used to build things that lasted, beams that carried weight, cables that sang in the wind, stones that resisted time. Now I live in moments, measured not by usefulness but by the echo they leave. Carl did not describe his location. He didn't mention names, battles, or commanders. Instead, he wrote of the wind, how it had changed, of the birds, how they no longer flew so low, of the snow, how it melted slower now, more stubborn. I don't know if I'll see the end. Maybe that's not for me. But I hope someone finds these pages, not because they matter, but because I did. That final sentence was underlined twice, not out of pride, but out of hope. Hope that someone, somewhere, would hear him through the dust and ash and frost. That even in a war filled with orders and silence, he had left something that wasn't destruction. There are no dates after that. No more diagrams. No more lists, sketches, or letters. Just that closing line, and beneath it a faint impression of his pencil pressed into the paper one last time, as if he wrote something, then erased it, or perhaps simply paused. Let your breath soften here. This is not an ending full of answers. It is a quiet closing of a life written between frostbitten hours and the roar of distant guns. And yet, in this stillness, in this final page, Carl reminds us of something lasting, that even in war we build, even in loss we remember, and even in silence we speak. Carl's own journal ends quietly, but his story doesn't. Long after his final page, fragments of him continue to echo, not in official reports or medals, but in the scribbled words of others. In one recovered notebook belonging to a soldier named Matthias, a brief mention stands alone. The engineer with the calm eyes. He fixed more than bridges, I think. Sometimes when the wind was loud, I'd find him drawing trees into the dirt with a stick. Another soldier, Anton, recorded a short entry during a lull between engagements. He spoke little, but when he did, it was about the shape of things, how weight moves, how silence settles. He once told me every structure, even a broken one, still remembers what it was meant to hold. That last line appears again, months later, in the pages of a medic's journal. This medic, unnamed, described watching Carl repair a snapped stretcher frame with careful, deliberate knots. He tied it like it was a violin, not a stretcher. Then he just said, "It's all weight in the end. People, timber, grief." And he smiled like that was enough. These mentions are rare, fleeting, not because Carl wasn't seen, but because he never asked to be remembered. He moved through the war like a scaffold, holding others up, reinforcing what was crumbling. And yet, even the most invisible pillars leave shadows. What others said about Carl was not detailed. They didn't tell his full story. They couldn't have known the sketches or the lists or the carved walls. But what they did capture was his presence, his steadiness, the way he carried silence, not as a burden, but as a language. Sometimes legacy isn't written in victories or losses. It's found in the quiet ways we shape the people beside us. Carl's voice may have faded from his own pages, but it whispered briefly through the hands of others. Years after the fighting ended, a group of local villagers, rebuilding a collapsed barn outside a small eastern town, discovered a buried entrance beneath shattered timbers. It was a root cellar, half filled with debris, ice, and silence. At first, they assumed it had been looted or abandoned, like so many others. But when one of them brought in a lantern and cleared the snow-coated stones, something unexpected caught the light. The walls were carved, not randomly, not by vandals, but by a deliberate, patient hand. They saw birds, trees, arches, small, faceless figures lying shoulder to shoulder, like ghosts standing in memory. No names, no explanation, just a rhythm of cuts, deep and shallow, forming a silent chorus of the life someone had refused to let vanish. Further in, they found a sealed tin container wrapped in a decaying cloth. Inside were brittle journal pages, some smudged, others perfectly preserved. A note rested at the top. "If you found this, you are not alone." It was unsigned, but it didn't need a name. The carvings had already spoken. The bridge sketches on the final pages had already whispered it. Carl had built this place not as shelter from bombs, but as a sanctuary from forgetting. And somehow the earth had kept his memory warm. The villagers didn't report it to authorities right away. One of them, an old woman, simply sat down beside the wall and traced a carved tree with her fingers. "Whoever made this wasn't trying to be found," she said. "He was trying to leave a little light. Close your eyes and imagine that room. Underground, cold, silent, but alive with the echo of a man who never stopped building, not with stone or steel, but with remembrance." In the next segment, we explore the bridge itself, not the physical one, but the one Carl described in sketches. The bridge to return, not across rivers, but across memory. There is no record of the bridge Carl designed ever being constructed. It existed only in graphite lines on yellowing paper, curves imagined by candlelight, annotated with gentle instructions to no one in particular. But as we linger in the quiet of his story, it becomes clear that bridge was never meant to be built in wood or steel. It was meant to be crossed in memory. Carl described its foundations not in measurements, but in emotions. Set one foot in longing, the other in grief. Let the center be stillness. In a sense, every journal entry he wrote, every sketch, every carved image, was a plank in that bridge. A way across the unspoken distances inside him. Distances between who he was and what war had asked of him. Between what he remembered and what he was willing to let go. Between survival and meaning. He never stood on that bridge in life. But perhaps in writing it, in drawing it, he laid the groundwork for others to walk it after him. We, the listeners, the readers, become the ones crossing it now. With every line we recall, with every breath taken in his story's silence, we step across something Carl left behind. We step through grief, into understanding, through memory, into witness. Let this thought settle with you. The most important bridges are not physical. They don't span rivers. They span hearts. They span history. They remind us that someone once stood here and chose to leave a mark. Now the story softens. Carl's voice has faded. The pages have ended. The cellar is empty but still echoing. And we are left with the quiet that cradles everything he did not say. Not all stories end in triumph. Some end with stillness. And in this case, that is enough. Silence followed Carl wherever he went, but not the loud kind that weighs on your chest. His was a cultivated silence, deliberate, measured, the kind of silence that listens, that observes, that waits until the world is ready to feel. It wasn't cowardice. It wasn't repression. It was reverence. He carried bridges within him, not just those that bore weight across rivers, but those that allowed memory to pass gently through time. His was the silence of understanding, of knowing that some truths don't need to be shouted. They can be whispered, carved into walls, tucked into journals, and left behind for those willing to sit long enough to hear. As you lie in the hush of your own room, imagine this: a single man beneath the earth, surrounded by frost and flickering light, carving what he could not say, sketching what he could not build. writing what he could not speak aloud. And yet, all of it remains. His silence did not erase him. It preserved him, and now it touches you, not in thunder, not in tears, but in stillness. You too are a witness. And perhaps one day, when you sit quietly and remember the small things, the smell of bread, the shape of trees, the sound of a loved one's laugh, you'll know what Carl meant when he wrote, "It's not the war I fear forgetting, it's the world I left behind it." Sleep gently now. Let silence carry you, as it once carried him.